or on your screen that you have your name as it appears on your license. If you guys want to have your camera off, you can. However, pop on every once in a while so that we know that you're actually still there. That's the reason for having the camera on. But if you want to take a moment and stretch while this is very boring, you can do that. Just like I said, pop in every once in a while and let us know that you're there. All righty. So what we're going to talk about today is the forms themselves, where you can get more information on particular resources, the unique features of what this is, and then we're going to let's do a deal and figure that out from beginning to end, and we'll have actually a couple different endings on it as well, and then we'll go over some specialty forms. This is a really fast section of it, so you're probably not going to get everything at this point, but you'll get started with it. And one thing I will tell you that I've learned from teaching this class, what I'm hearing is that people go back and take a transaction that you did like last fall that, either terminated or whatever, and using those points that are on that transaction, fill out the paperwork on this one. Actually, you'll end up learning it even better than me talking to you about it. So let's dive in. So why do we have the Oregon Realtor forms? That's a really good question everybody's asking. And my slide, there it is. Okay. Move things out here. Okay. One of the things that kind of got started with the Oregon Realtors is they believe that transactional forms should be a not-for-profit member benefit. So as part of your dues, you're paying for all of these forms. They're high quality, business friendly forms. They were written by real estate attorneys that are with the Oregon Realtors, and but edited by a group of us. I was part of it, of about 8 or 10 that are from around the state, everywhere from Klamath Falls all the way up to Portland and out to Bend.
You can have it low and turn up the mic.
Okay, we need to have you turn your, there you go. That have actually reviewed all of this, and we've done a lot of testing to see that what is it well at work and how well it works. So it's very responsive. One of the things that we will be doing is introducing new forms as we go along, plus we'll be editing them. So you're going to hear about that as well. One of the other things that came up was that probably 90% of the calls that the Realtor hotline had was for questions on the forms. And that's when they realized that we needed something that has to do with the forms of what we know we have to have. And so now the legal hotline is a member benefit. You don't have to pay a subscription to get it. Now, with that said, it is always best to talk to your managing principal broker before you call the legal hotline on it, because that's actually the first thing they're going to ask is, what have you talked to your managing broker? Part of the issue is that sometimes it's best practices and not a legal issue on the form. So just kind of keep that in mind. The unique features, it focuses on the language of the agreement between the parties, not a guidance to the clients. One of the things is that we have to remember in a transaction, it is really, we are just the facilitator of the buyer and the seller. Those are the parties that are doing the transaction. So we've got the Oregon Realtor Buyer Seller Advisories that are online. We're going to talk about that in a minute. That is actually a part of the purchase and sale agreement, the PSA, and you'll need to make sure that you give it to your clients. It enhances the business practice and it benefits the consumer. Clear and thorough procedures for all the common transaction scenarios. You're going to see this when we get to like the termination and all of that, of what we have done to make it easier for you. Okay, one of the questions we always get is, it's a library versus a platform. It's on zip forms. It's OR forms are a library. Think of it this way: they're the books, and you have to have the library to put them in. And so that's what the OREF forms, the other forms that you may get from MLS, you may get from your association, those are all books that would go into a platform. Platforms are Zip Forms, SkySlope, and Loop are the ones that we have worked with to get the library into it. However, note if you have another one that really needs to be done, let us know, and we'll work on getting permissions set up to do all of that. So in order for you to use the forms, you have to have a delivery platform and the library. You got to have both. Now, one of the things that we also did was we negotiated with Zip Forms, SkySlope, and Loop in the fact that you can get the forms on those platforms at no charge. It's included, I shouldn't say, it's included in your dues that you pay. So keep that in mind, that there isn't an extra charge to be in Zip Forms or SkySlope. That is all done through the Oregon Realtors. That was part of the stuff that we went through. All righty, learning resources. And I see we got a couple chats here. You got this class that's about 2 hours. It's been running about 2.5 hours, so we'll get to it. And then you've got 24-hour training opportunities. There's little snippets that are done on each of the forms. That's on the Oregon Realtors Forms website, and that's the orforms.org. There's, if you just need, hey, I need to know how to do this one form, you can go in there and pick that one form and take it. And then there's a online ed has a class that is done by Jeff Wyron and Ashley Fordham, and they've done it, and it's free on online ed. So if you're go ahead and get yourself signed up. Just a little side note, I am the online ed instructor for all the CE classes. So if you have a question that you have during that class, it'll come to me. So you guys will see me. Okay, new member benefit. This is a little out of date. I know the new slides that are updated are coming out on Friday for us teachers. That figures. It's coming in early this month. It's here. Yay. Big thing you need to remember is orforms.org. That's the big thing. And then you can go in, you can look at the forms. This is just a sample of it. I'm going to kind of skip through this because you have full access to all of the forms. And like I said, take a transaction that you did earlier and use it and get onto the forms and see what happens. So let's talk a little bit about how this is set up. One of the things that we did was created a numbering system that makes sense to how we do things. So if the forms start with a 1, it is a purchase and sale agreement. If it starts with a 2, it's an addendum. If it starts with a 3, it's a disclosure. And that makes it easy. You don't have to try to go through every single one. They are in that order. We did this on purpose for the sake of being able to make it a little easier on us. And I apologize, my dog is scratching at the door, so you guys probably hear that. Again, training. You can watch this video again. We have it online with Oregon Forms. We have it, by individual. We're even doing in-person classes in some areas. There are about 10 or 12 instructors. They're everywhere from Eastern Oregon all the way around. So if you want to do it again in person, just let us know. But there's a lot of videos on it as well. So the just-in-time video library goes through an annotated version of the forms, includes a video walkthrough on each provision, and you'll kind of get an idea when we get into the hang on guys, sorry about that. Sorry about that. My dog was tearing down my door. Anyhow, get back here. The video walkthrough of each provision. You're going to see how it's going to be set up as we go forward in this class. You'll see how we have little instruction bullets that will come through. So it's not designed to teach you the entire library. However, it is there so that you can get to one form that you need. And this is one thing, it's Saturday evening at 8 o'clock and you can't get a hold of your principal broker. You may be able to get some hints here and do that. And one of the things also is that these are taught by managing principal brokers or attorneys. So we are at that level that we know what we're talking about. Those of us that are doing these, we've written them out. So we don't be surprised. Also, I think I talked about this earlier. Jeff Wyron and Ashley Fordham did a really good job of this class on online ed. You can take it, sign up for it. And if there's sections of it that you want to go over again, go right ahead and go to online ed. It is a member benefit there is no charge for this particular class. And again, the questions you have, go to me. If you want to go through more classes, there's on the orforums.org, there's going to be classes. One of the things that they're doing right now is what's called Friday Forums. So every Friday at 10 o'clock, there will be a class online that will go over a form and kind of get you used to any particular one. So definitely watch that calendar, or just plan on every Friday you're going to go to the Oregon Forms Friday and learn about the newest and latest and greatest. Okay. Of course, this is a little out of date because we have started those additional forms classes. Like I said, the Friday forms. We are putting together a broker risk management training session that is in progress. A lot of the videos and forms and scenarios. And then we'll have forums at our spring and fall governance meetings. So if you are there, we'll have, you'll have the ability to ask the attorneys, Jeremy and Nicholas, about certain things. And those of us on the committee will probably be in attendance at that as well. So business practices. You are giving expert advice is the key value that you bring your buyer and sellers. We know that, we've done that for years. The client advisories 10.1 and 10.2 are integral to the purchase and sale agreement. That's what PSA, if you see that on our slides, that's what it means. And it must be given prior to a transaction. It is written into the contract that you have given them that form. It is, I know it's 40, 50 pages. I get it, but it's really good information. It is taking what they used to have just online and put it into a booklet form for your clients. I suggest that you have them initial it so that you show that you gave it to them. It's best practices. And then, client counseling sessions are ideal for providing advisories, acknowledging relationships, confirming representation agreements in writing. There's one for the buyer and there's one for the seller. And that's what they look like. And there's 10.1 and 10.2. Again, advisories are under that, that section. Section 10. There we go. Oops. These are the different forms that also are there for the buyer representation agreements and all of that. So you do have those available to you. We won't go over those today, but we'll talk about, we'll have a special class just on those forms as well. So let's do a deal. This is where it really gets into things. And before I get to deal, let's see what chats do we have. Oh, somebody asked about it. All of the things that I showed you, the list and all of that is in the library. And in fact, that list is the very top item that's on there so that you can print it out, have it for yourself, figure out. But there's a little trick that I'm going to show you here in a minute about those forms. So let's do a deal. We've got Walter and Letitia Everest, trustees of the WB and LC Everest Revocable Living Trust. That's a mouthful. And their agents are John Wright, Laney Wright, Billy L. Burns, and with the WOW Team Brokers. Notice there's 3 brokers. Buyers are 3 buyers, Daniel Probst, Jamie Evans, and Randy Evans. And then Stephanie Trueheart from One World Realty represents them. The reason why we have this is you'll get to see here in a minute. So what we're going to do, we're going to do a deal. It is for 1171 Southwest Millstone, Centerton, Oregon. And asking price is 4075. It's a 1967, important to note the date, single family, fireplace, half-acre lot, attached garage, 500 square feet, detached shop, access via an easement across the neighbor's property. The personal property that they want is a range, refrigerator, washer, dryer, riding lawnmower, but it excludes a fancy door knocker on the front door. There is a tenant in there that has been there on that's on a 1-year fixed term lease, occupied for 10 and a half months. The note is that in the first year, the 30-day no clause termination is allowed. That's as of right now. There's a whole bunch of stuff coming through, not only our Oregon legislature, but the city of Eugene is doing some things. So be wary of that information as well. And we're going to keep up to date on the forms as the laws change. Okay, so now the buyers are going to make the offer of, was 4075 was the asking. They're going to come in at 385 with $4,000 earnest money, and then the property, personal property, as we described, owner occupied conventional loan. Keep in mind the seller has a tenant. This is going to be owner occupied. 15% down with 50% cash and 50% gift from the parents. The seller is to pay $8,000 for a temporary rate buy down. 15 business days for due diligence, 525 home warranty that the seller pays. Closing is 75 calendar days. Important to note. After acceptance, possession at 5 p.m. of closing, and their offer expires in 48 hours. Okay, so what are we going to need? We're going to need the residential purchase and sale agreement. We're going to need a general addendum. In 1967, it was done before 1978, so we're going to need the lead-based hazards. We're going to talk about that. So it doesn't say paint, it says hazards, because there's more than just paint. Tenant occupied property, there's a form for that. Counteroffer, repair addendum and notice, default, notice of default and termination. We're going to actually do two different scenarios, one where they close it and one where they terminate it. So you can kind of see how this all works. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the residential sale, purchase and sale agreement. One of the things you're going to like is that we've condensed everything to the first page and a half. The rest of it ends up being just verbal words that people need to read and go over, but there's nothing you have to fill out. Okay. Again, unique features that's on the first 2 pages are all the unique features. Timeframes are on pages 2 to 4. And then standard provisions not to be modified start on page 4. So those are the boilerplate stuff that we've always had that we have to look for all the different pieces. No, they're all going to be on those first couple of pages. The expiration of the offer date and time and everything is still going to be at the end of the transaction or the paperwork. You'll see it just like we do now. So it incorporates the addendum. It's a regular residential, but then it's got an addenda based on the property type. New construction is just an addendum. Investment property is just an addendum. Historic property and properties with associations, addendums. There's a specialized addenda for disclosure and deal negotiations, like agency, final agency acknowledgement, lead-based paint hazards, tenant occupied, well, septic, wood stoves. We're used to those. Pre or post closing occupancy. That is in there. And then the contingent right to buy or sell is also addendums. Those are specialized that are in the library. So final agency acknowledgement. Remember, the final agency acknowledgement is a required document. It is required. And so we have it as a standalone sheet. It's the first page. It has a room for 3 agents and also 3 buyers or sellers. And you'll notice on this one, there's 2, but on the final version, there was 3. So let's look at this. So, I forgot to talk about the sale agreement. The sale agreement is the number that's up in the corner here. One nice thing is that the size of that line is the same on every single form. It doesn't shrink and grow or anything based on the different forms. So once you put that in, you don't have to modify it afterwards. Property address, we talked about it, Southwest Millstone and Centerton. Got that. There's Stephanie Trueheart, the name of the buyer's agent. And on this one, again, there's only room for 2, but on the final version, there's 3 buyers and 3 sellers, agents. So we've got that in there, with the license number. Oops. And then you've got the 3 sellers agents in there with their license number and all their information. So that was one of the things that we've talked about, is how do you do it with, you've got a buyer's agent on a team. Well, this answers that question. Now, if you have more than 3, yes, we're going to have to do an addendum that says see attached. But for now, 3 is the limit that we had for the size of the paper. Now, again, this is a standalone form, as in it's only 1 page. You will have to do it for every single transaction. So if you write 3 offers for buyers before you can get one going, you will have to do this again, because the seller's agents will change as it goes along. Okay, so he identifies up to 4 buyers or sellers, financing items, and other addenda to be attached. This is probably the biggest thing that I like how we did this. It came out really well. First off, look at, you have the buyer and sale agreement, and this is where it actually says buyer and seller acknowledge that they have read and understood the Oregon Realtors buyer and seller advisories respectively. It says it's part of the contract that they have received it and they can look through it. If they have questions, do to the best of your ability to answer it. If they have questions that, they can seek legal counsel. But it is important that you have that, because it is part of the the purchase and sale agreement. Here we have our sellers and our buyers. Again, more than 1. That's great. You'll notice on the seller, it's the trust is 1 line, and then the seller's trustees are on the lines 2 and 3. That's what's nice about this. You can put that trust in there and say that it is part of the trust. Property description, it does have the ability to have that extra information about the lot and block number, tax and block, boy, can't talk this morning, block and lot number. And this becomes a little bit important in cases where, and I always use my own house in Eugene when we sold it. Our house was built on 2 lots, with the driveway and 6 inches of the house on 1 lot and the rest of the house on the other. Well, obviously you have to sell both lots at the same time. And that was important. That actually got missed in the preliminary title report, that there was a second lot. And this puts it in there so that you have it. And so it has all of the information on it. This should transfer over from the MLS. So, but I would always double check it like we do now. Okay, this is where it gets fun. You've got your purchase price, you've got the earnest money, we've got the down payment, because we've had to do math, 15%. Buyer's closing costs, it actually says buyer's closing costs and prepaid items to be paid by seller in the amount of, so we have it right up front, right there. And then it says non-contingent and non-liquid funds, if there is any. And keep in mind, cash means you can go down to the bank, get a cashier's check this afternoon and give it to them, and they can cash it. If they have any other involvement with anybody to get that money, a 401k loan, a bank of ma and pa, whatever, needs to be presented. And so that you have to say, and they do it on this one, 50% of the form of a gift from the buyer's parents goes into it. This is a conventional loan. But you'll notice that it says FHA, VA, and notice how it's got the form number afterwards. This is what's really nice. If for some reason you clicked FHA, the form 2.19 will actually show up on the back end. So as you're putting this whole deal together and you've clicked different boxes that have a number by them, that form will show up. Unfortunately, one of the problems is that if you click the wrong one, it still shows up, so you'll have to take it out. But That's the nice thing. You don't have to remember to go find it. It's already going to be there for you. Conveyance is a deed or seller carried promissory note, any land sales contract. That's we've actually put in the information on that. Closing, see addendum A. Remember, there was a thing about 75 days and removing the tenant and all of that. So that is still there. Also, same little trick that you have with zip forms, in that if it's a date, hit the space bar and you can type in. Prorations as of closing. Title company, one of the things that we heard that we see a lot of is that you wanted not only the company, and this one is lands and title and escrow, but also the officer that we would like to have work do that transaction. That we would, as a reviewing broker for Remax, I see a lot of them where they just put in the name of the person that they want to go to. They put in Sandy Albertson. They wouldn't even put in what Western Title. They don't even put that in there. They just put the officer's name. No, this one actually says this is the escrow company and this is the officer that we're requesting. And then, personal property as is, range, oven, refrigerator, washer, dryer, riding lawnmower. Excluded fixtures. We said about the door knocker and they don't put it in there. So that's going to be something for the counter. I just talked about it. Non-liquid funds can be the sale of a house or retirement portfolio, whatever it is. Again, if they can't go down to the bank and get that money right now, then that is a non-liquid funds. Possession date, one of the things I always say is put in a date. Don't put in 3 days after closing, or 75 days. That's what they're saying in addendum A, but always put in an actual date. Okay. This is something that a lot of people don't realize. Line 39, number 10, construction. It is new construction, or there's been more than 50,000 in remodeling within 90 days of closing. That is something that you've got to remember. 50,000 of remodeling. Let's say they have a roof and a kitchen put in. That could easily be $50,000 easily. Not any one item, but total. If that's the case, then you need to use form 4.1. Again, you click that and it will bring up 4.1. The $50,000 in remodeling is probably the one area that we have not been doing a good job with, but that is actually part of the statute with the CCB. So it is now in here, and you need to ask the question. And keep in mind, if it was done 6 months ago, you don't need to worry about it because it's 90 days of closing. It all has to do with liens that contractors can put on the property. So in line 11, we've got tenant occupied. Yes or no? Yes. And if it's tenant occupied, if they're going to take it out and take that tenant out, then it'll tell you which form to use. Is there a homeowners association of any sort? Is it a purchase? Is there a contingency? The buyer needs to buy. And also, if you'll notice, the seller needs to buy. The seller is selling, but they have to have time to get the other one closed as well. So there is now a form for seller purchase contingency. Water, sewer, of course, in our practice, it's all public water and public sewer. However, if you have a private well or community well or on-site sewage system, those forms would actually come up, and they're on different timelines. They're there. And again, community well is up to four homes. Anything over that becomes a association for that. Lead-based hazard. If it was done before 1978, it needs to have it. Now, one of the questions that I get asked often on this is that some of the counties will do, the house was built in 1933, but its effective date is in 1983. You have to go with the furthest out date. So even though it was probably totally remodeled, it might have even burned down and was rebuilt, but you have to go off of the 1933 date on it. And we're going to go over, because like I said, it's not paint, it's also other hazards that we'll go through. Wood stove insert, again, if it's yes, that form will come up. Equipment, property contains leased financed equipment. Probably this is one that we're seeing more and more, is that there are leased solar panels on houses. And that's, you got to make sure that they can be transferred, that the account can be transferred. Some of the early ones, they can't. So they're going to go up there and remove the solar panels, and there's some holes in your roof. So that is something to be asked about if they have a lease on their solar panels. Is it a historic property? That one, one of the areas that I talk about a lot is the fact that on historic property, even though you may be buying an empty lot in a historic district, your buyer needs to understand that that's in a historic district, and there may be certain rules that they have to follow in order to build a house in that area. So not just that you're buying a house that was built in 1890, you're building, or you're buying the lot next to the house built in 1890, and they want you to look, it can look like it was built in 1890. Home warranty, this is where we have the information of yes or no, what it is, and what the, which company, how much, all of that. Please figure that out beforehand. Just don't say yes. That is one area that we see a lot of, is just yes. Well, what does that mean? FIRPTA, that is, a seller is a foreign person under the U.S. code. FIRPTA, of course, is the foreign seller. That you need to find out. The title companies and escrow companies are really good now to help us with that. So it's yes, form 2.7, or no. There is not a FIRPTA advisory. I've been asked that. However, there is FIRPTA language in the buyer and seller books, that the advisory book. So it's in there. It's just not a separate advisory on it. And then additional provisions, see addendum A. We talked about that. And
we have one question in the chat. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. What do we got?
So, possession.
Okay, first thing, on the form, you should be able to go into the whatever, Zip Forms, SkySlope, whichever platform, and you might have to actually download them. There is instructions on the orforms.org website that says, okay, if you've got SkySlope, this is how you do it. If you've got .loop, this is how you do it. So you should have access to them now. They're available. Possession, if property doesn't close on time, what do you then what if you put a date? Remember, one of the things that if you got to manage your dates, if you put that it's going to close on April 15th and they need till April 20th, you just do an addendum like we've always done. The closing is extended. The same as we would have in any other transaction. Monitor your dates and know them. Hopefully that answered that one. Okay. So let's go to the general addendum. This is, you'll see the forms come up. You'll see that it's the address. It's got all of the people, everybody's names on it. It's right here. It is addendum A. We have that, so we know that which addendum it is. And then agreement. The parties agreed to as follows. That's, pretty much what we have now. But what we want to say is this is the way the attorneys wrote it. So we'll go from there with it. But per section 4E of the purchase and sale agreement, sellers to pay $8,000 at close of escrow towards a 2-1 buy down of buyer's mortgage and interest rate. You're clarifying something that you wrote in earlier. And then the closing date to be 75 calendar days after mutual acceptance of the PSA. Again, I would put in an actual date, figure that out, because of the fact that calendar days could be kind of need a little more information. Before I go to that, let's just one more chat. Yep. And okay, again, what you'll need to do is on all of these to get the forms, go to orforms.org and they will tell you how to download them. It's actually fairly easy. to get it. And it should be free. If they want to start charging you something, call or email the Oregon Forums and they'll walk you through it. Okay, lead-based hazards. The reason why we have said hazards is because it's not just paint. There's now a lot more that needs to be involved. As addendum that is now both the disclosure and creates a timeline to negotiate repairs, creates more clarity around how and when the disclosure is to be given, consequences or for failure and late disclosure, improves the understanding of the assessment requirements, and specifies the timeframes for a termination if the buyer determines it is necessary. I got just tongue-tied this morning, I tell you. Okay, so let's go through this. Top portion is pretty much the same as we have on all of them. Lead warning statement. This talks about all of the different things that are going to be on there. Of course, 1978, one of the questions I always get asked when I talk about lead-based paint is that, well, Oregon banned lead-based paint in 1972. Well, they were given 6 years to use up the inventory. So the federal rule is 1978, January 1st or after 1978. So that is why it is there. And no, even though they stopped selling it in Oregon, it's could still have been out there. But they also have, that's the lead warning. There's also other things that come up, like for instance, contaminated dust. You know, if you do some paint scraping and the paint pieces go out, that dust, those pieces are all part of that. And then the other thing is that there was lead used in water pipes. So there could be something there. It is, you have the ability to go in and make sure that you have the lead testing. Now, let's talk about the lead hazard information pamphlet. I'm sorry, guys, it's just one of those days. That EPA booklet, and it's the next slide here. Let me, oops. Oh, I'll go back. Okay. Make sure that they have it. And the way that we have set this up is that when you bring this form up, that booklet actually comes up and gets added to your transaction, because we need to show that it was actually given. So a couple of things. Read this. Seller represent that the seller or seller's agent have provided buyer or buyer's agent. Now, that's the way that the law is written. That's not how we've normally done it in practice. Usually the buyer's agent has given it to the buyer well ahead of time. But technically, the way that the law is written, it says that seller is to give it to the buyer. And we got confirmation that the seller's agent or buyer's agent can be give the form. One of the things that is going to be important, and I just want to I'll remind you of this as we go along. When we have gone through the EPA audits on this and having to look at it, one of the things the auditor was always looking for was that the seller signed before the buyer signed. Because again, seller has to give it to the buyer. So if the buyer signs it first and then the seller signs it, that actually that goes against the law of it. You need to be giving it from the seller to the buyer. So keep that in mind. So there's that EPA lead protector family booklet that we've seen. If buyer does not receive the EPA pamphlet from seller along with this form, buyer may terminate the agreement at any point before closing by delivering to seller form 5.3 buyer's notice of termination. That is that's a big issue. Keep in mind, if they don't get that lead-based hazard booklet, the EPA booklet, they could walk at the day of closing, and that's within their rights. So that's probably one of the bigger things. Failure to ever provide a lead-based hazard addendum gives the buyer right to terminate up until close COA, close of escrow. And that's probably not used very often, but you need to know that it's there. So how I always say is getting that out there from the seller to the buyer at the first opportunity is the best way to do it. Now, putting it on the MLS and having it there so that you can download it does not constitute delivery. You have to show that they actually got it, that it was actually done. So while it's nice to have it, it's good, you know, it's like the seller's property disclosure. It's nice to have it on that MLS. It does not constitute delivery. You need to make sure that the seller or seller's agent delivers it to the buyer or buyer's agent. If the buyer has
Great.
received,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry. I can't
That's
hit
okay.
the mute button fast enough. We've got a couple questions in the chat.
okay. Okay, we're actually gonna talk about mixing forms together. So I'll get to that here in just a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
That's fine. Again, make sure that you get those forms. This is a pretty serious one because of the fact that if you end up with a for some reason the EPA fines you for your failure to do something, that's a $25,000 fine. So keep that in mind. And that may go not to you, but it actually could go to the seller or the buyer. So keep that in mind as we go along. I'm serious with the EPA stuff. If any of you have gone through an audit, you'll understand with me. There are two places for the buyers to initial. The first one says, I have received the informational pamphlet. That's where the buyer initials. And then that they have received the above disclosure and copies of reports and records, if there are any. Oh, come on. I want to get the thing out here. Seller has knowledge that the property contains lead-based paint or lead hazards. And then you need to explain out what they have and what they don't have. We did this in this manner so that there isn't that chance that they, check the wrong box, which we've been dealing with. Then it says seller has given buyers copy of all seller's lead-based paint and lead hazard evaluation reports, and seller has no lead-based. So you have one or two, and then the no reports, but they believe that they could have it. And then the seller has no knowledge of any lead-based paint or lead hazards on the property. Again, the buyer has gotten all the information and they have agreed to it. So there's two places on here where the buyer initials. And we're going to be looking for those. Okay. You basically have choose the time frame. Buyer shall have 10 calendar days. EPA does calendar days. They do not do business days. Mutual acceptance. The buyer shall have X business days after mutual acceptance to do a test, or they can waive the right to do it. Most of the time, we're probably going to see the 10 days. But if for some reason, let's just say that the seller had all the reports, I would choose the second box and say, buyer shall have 3 business days to conduct the risk assessment or do an additional inspection. They have all the information. They may not want to wait the 10 days, but that is there for them. And then if they waive the right, make sure that you've gone over their rights and regulations. The termination, it does require that there is an actual test. You can't just say, hey, I'm using the lead-based paint as a way to cancel out the transaction. Nope. You've got to have an actual test. Yes, it could be one of those little Home Depot sticks that you do it and you can say, yep, here it is. Probably that's going to a little bit of a thin line on it, but you need to do evaluation, assessment, or inspection must have been done to terminate and use this transaction, unless they have not been given the pamphlet. So that is a big thing that you need to remember. That is a little bit different in practice, is that you do have to have a test. And notice the termination. Failure to timely terminate or agree to the lead-based hazard repairs is an as-is acceptance. So if you do nothing and you get past your 10 calendar days, your clock is done. You can't do, there's no way you can terminate based on this. So let's see what we got in chat.
Yeah, we got a few.
Yep, I see that now. termination, the termination policy, that has to do with the EPA laws. So that should, I can't speak for OREF, so I don't know how they have that in there, but the termination policy is as we were told by the EPA, our lawyers, I should say, that wrote this, was told to write it up that way. So yes, this form is supposed to come from the seller. What I would probably best practices to do is to, talk to your buyer about it and then request it once you give this offer to the selling agent as part of their confirmation that they have received the offer, should send this form to the buyer's agent so that it's done while there's being negotiations being done. The rule is, just like on seller's property disclosure, it's supposed to be done at the time of the transaction. In 2007 and 8, when we were all living through that, where we were putting 1 year deadlines on transactions, just hoping you could sell, there's a lot of stuff that can happen. So the rule is that it must be done at the time of the offer. So you can, hopefully that answers that question. You can wait till acceptance, but I would do it right up front, way up front with it. Is there a cover sheet to pre-fill with information? I know that Zip Forms and SkySlope did. I don't know if .loop did. That is actually, that cover sheet where you can fill in everything is part of their platform, not anything that we've done. So there is, I know on Zip Forms and SkySlope that there is. Okay, so let's go on. One of the things you notice on the other forms where you had to initial at the top, this one you only have to say, it says that you acknowledge that you've given all the information, and your signature down here is important, and the date. Again, we want to show that the seller and the seller's agent all signed before the buyers and the buyer's agent. That's really important to make sure that that gets done. And see what we did with here? Like I said, if you do the lead-based paint form, this actually will come up. And this is part of the addendum. We've actually, it's got a sale agreement number. It will come up, and it is the entire booklet. So one of the things that you don't have to worry is try to find it and bring it back up again. Yes, if you're writing 3 offers for a buyer, you're going to get it 3 different times, but let's make sure that we get it to them rather than not to them. Okay, okay, we're doing fine on time. More sections requiring actions, definitions of time, dates, earnest money provisions, and more. We're going to talk about pages 2 and 3. Again, if you looked at page 1, all of the dates, the times, the important stuff that we always having to look, is this a private well or not? That sort of thing. It's all on page 1. That's the nice thing about it. So page 2 has counting time. We are using business days or calendar days, and everything is done basically by the business day. Unless it is said, if anybody says anything about a calendar day, the exception is lead-based paint, lead-based hazard. I'm having to remember how to say that. It is in the time zone of the property. I know one of the problems we've had in the past is that the property is in Oregon, and they've already moved to, Alabama, and they are in a totally different time zone. Well, the property is in Oregon. It needs to be in Oregon time. Counting the days, just like we've always been doing, it's the next day after mutual agreement. So next business days, you sign it on Saturday, and it's a 3-day weekend. That next business day is going to be Tuesday. If it's calendar days, the next day, Sunday, is going to be your date. And then we also talk about that it is the standard of practice that it is 5 p.m. on the business day and 11:59 p.m. on a calendar day. So a calendar day is midnight to 11:59. Specific dates that when a box is to be checked, we really, really, really suggest that you check a box. You'll notice this on here, that it's 3 days, if not filled in or blank. We put those in there. You'll notice that there's a box for the check mark, and I'm going to move that there. So 3 business days or blank business days, check the box. One of the problems that we have with the current forms is that they have, did they miss it? Did they not miss it? We want to make sure that we're very clear and on the business days. So earnest money deposit within 3 business days or 10 business days, whatever it happens to be. Then again, if it's something special, you can always do an addendum that says, the earnest money is going to be, 50% on this date and then 50% on another date. You can actually put that in. Again, this is going to be looking for a number, hit the space bar. It will give you the ability to type in a letter. So yeah, 1 business day. Earnest money failure gives seller a process for undeposited funds or funds that are deemed insufficient or returned by buyer's bank. One of the things that we heard as we were putting all of this together was that I was actually shocked how many times the earnest money check comes in and it bounces. And what we found out was that a lot of people don't keep that amount of money in their checking account. They may have moved it over to their checking account from their savings account, but it didn't happen. And so the check bounces. So I was surprised on that. I didn't know that. So, but what they do is you can send a notice of default to the buyer, fix the problem, or potentially lose earnest money anytime before closing, or terminate the deal within 2 business days after deadline, refund any buyer's earnest money, give up liquidated damages. One of the things you're going to see a lot of in our on the new forms is that there is an opportunity to cure, is what we're calling it. And that means that, hey, buyer seller, you didn't do this, or you did do this, and we want you to fix it. And giving everybody a chance to do that, to actually go in and fix an item. You don't just terminate, if they just need to have one more thing. Like I said, insufficient funds on the earnest money check. Well, technically, the seller could say, fine, you're terminated. However, the seller sends out an addendum that says, hey, you have 24 hours to cure this problem, or we're going to terminate. So we've put that in a lot of different areas, the ability for the other party to step up to the plate. You'll notice that within 2 business days of the earnest money, seller can terminate the transaction by delivering a Form 5.4 seller's notice of termination to buyer, at which point any earnest money buyer has provided will be refunded to the buyer. So, if the seller has to do, if the buyer has not gotten the earnest money there, or there's a problem, they can go in and give them the opportunity, in this case, 2 business days, to fix the problem, or terminate the deal. Buyer representations duties regarding financing. They either have a pre-approval letter within, or they'll get one within 2 business days or X, and or the buyer must submit such evidence to seller a pre-approval deadline. You can create a deadline, and then with 5 business days or blank, fill in a number. The buyer must provide seller with evidence from a lender that a buyer has submitted the buyer's intention to proceed with the loan. Buyer will act promptly and in good faith to take steps necessary to obtain the loan. One of the problems that we have come across and heard stories of as we were putting this section together is that the buyer, they sign the transaction, everything gets done. The buyer's agent doesn't send over the set of forms to the lender, and the buyer is thinking that their agent did it, but they didn't. And so all of a sudden, 3 weeks in, somebody says, what's going on with the lender? And the lender's like, I don't have anything. I don't know. So that is why this is in there, is that buyer must provide seller evidence from the lender that has submitted the buyer's intent to proceed with the loan. Now, what does that mean? What is evidence? Well, it could be an email that says, congratulations on this. We'll get you started. That could be as simple as that, but just an acknowledgement that the lender knows what's going on. I have the distinct feeling that as the lenders start to use this transaction or these forms, they'll start providing that evidence of it as well. It just says, hey, we've got you going. That's all we need. But again, don't want to wait 3 weeks and find out that the lender was never notified. Got those two? Okay. By X business day following the end of the due diligence period or blank business days, a buyer must order appraisal. This has been, kind of ends up being the standard of practice that the buyer is going to either wait through the due diligence period and then order the appraisal, or maybe they will do, within 2 business days after mutual acceptance, they will order the appraisal. You have the option to say which one you're going to do. That way it's clear, everybody knows what's going on, and the seller knows that they may be waiting 2.5 weeks while they get through the due diligence period, but that's that is now in there in writing for you. Financing contingencies. If the parties have agreed that the buyer is purchasing the property with a loan, buyer's obligation to purchase the property contingent on buyer and property qualifying, heard that one before, and the lender's appraisal being equal to or greater than the purchase price, appraisal contingency. The buyer must notify the seller of financing failure within a specific time. So if the seller or the loan officer says, hey, we've got a problem, we can't do this, and they end up changing banks, or it becomes a failure, a financing failure, the buyer can say, hey, I'll back out, I want my earnest money back, or be able to go to a different bank, that they failed to qualify for the loan. One of the issues, people said, well, what would happen? Well, obviously, losing a job would give you a failure for a loan. But one of the problems that we had here, especially during the COVID, was that if you were self-employed, the banks weren't loaning to self-employed people because they figured that we weren't working. And so there were only certain banks that would actually do self-employed funding for loans. And so you may have started it, but then all of a sudden they say, oh, wait a minute, too much of your income is self-employed. They change banks. That's an example of why this is in there, is that you can find another bank and get in there. Now, if it, goes from 6% to 12%, that's a big enough change that the buyer can back out and say that they are no longer qualified. But we wanted to, again, opportunity to cure is in there. If the financing fails and the buyer doesn't terminate, renegotiation begins. Parties agree to the negotiation period upfront at submission of the offer, and then within 2 days after the end of negotiations, either party may terminate and all money is returned to buyer unless the buyer and seller fail to reach an agreement on that. If the buyer nor seller delivers that form within 2 business days at the end of the the financing renegotiation period, all parties have deemed to approve the transaction and without financing contingency, and the buyer will be deemed to have released buyer's rights under the financing contingency. That's an important change. So let's go over that again. If neither the buyer nor the seller delivers form 5.3 or 5.4, the termination, within 2 business days, and we don't give you an option there, it's 2 business days, after the end of the financing renegotiation period, these are the dates that you wrote up here in this section, up here, the parties will be deemed to have approved the transaction and are proceeding. You need to make sure that you understand that if you don't do anything, that contingency, like due diligence, has sunsetted and you're moving on forward. Proof of cash. Definitely one of the issues that we've been seeing. If it is cash, what is it? They need to provide it within 2 business days. Proof of funds deadline. The buyer will provide the seller verification reasonably satisfactory to seller of sufficient and available funds to close this transaction. One of the problems also is just a little side note. We keep seeing it's a screenshot off of their bank account on their website. And it doesn't say the name of the person. It doesn't have, which branch it is. That it just says this is the amount of money, and many times doesn't even have the bank. Remember to make sure that it has that person's name and the bank name on it. Contingent right to purchase is in here. There it is. Seller may terminate transaction over proof of funds if the buyer fails to provide the proof of funds, or seller is dissatisfied with the proof based on reasonably objective criteria and communicates this to the buyer within 2 business days. Now, why would a seller be dissatisfied? In one of the transactions, as we were putting this whole section together, there have been some buyers that tried to show cryptocurrency to be able to pay for the property. Well, if you paying attention to the news, cryptocurrency is very volatile, and the seller may say, no, that is not a U.S. bank funds, and we're not going to do it. So that is a example of somebody where the sellers could say they're dissatisfied. Pretty hard if it's just a standard bank and they have proof of funds. The seller's going to have to give a pretty good reason of why they would not do that. See, we have a chat. Yep, they say lenders are already updating pre-approval letters and process. That's one of the things we're hearing is a couple of the instructors for the forums have been saying they've been doing more classes to the lenders and to the title companies than anybody else. So they're on top of it. So section 29, due diligence. True due diligence provisions plus timeframes for negotiation and forms are to be used. So let's talk about this. Due diligence, that is not a family member of mine. I constantly get that joke. And so the diligent includes comprehensive inspections, investigations, and assessments. Physical suitability, economic feasibility still requires approval for anything invasive. But in this particular case, sewer scope, radon test, oil tank locate, and mold testing are not considered invasive. But it does require the restoration of the property following any inspections on the buyer's behalf. One thing to note is that it needs to be with, if it's going to be an unlicensed person, the seller needs to agree to it in writing. You want to write it out that Uncle Joe is going to check the crawl space, whatever. Because the reason for that is that if Uncle Joe goes under there and breaks the water pipe during the inspection and doesn't say anything, who's going to fix it? With a licensed contractor, they are obligated to fix anything that they damage while they're under the house. Just an example. So, take it with a grain of salt on unlicensed people, but there may be times when that just makes sense. Due diligence is the same thing. Again, put it in writing if it's something where the seller may or may not, they don't want to call radon test invasive, but the radon test is they really want to have the house as closed up as possible. And normal enter and exiting of the property is fine. However, if it's, July, it's a really warm day and they don't have air conditioning and they open the windows, that'll throw the radon test off. So while we don't call it invasive, you've got to make sure that all parties understand how those tests are going to be taken. Okay, practice, another note. Time frame is to complete the entire process, meaning 15 business days. You have your inspections. You have your repair requests for repairs. You have a counter request for repairs. You do all of those things within those 15 business days. We're used to that standard of practice. So keep that in mind. Buyer has 15 business days to complete all inspection, survey, tests, and negotiations. Until closing, if this transaction is terminated, up to 10 business days after termination, Upon the request, buyers must provide a copy of any inspection report, survey, or test requested by the seller. One of the things you need to note is that if until closing, the seller requests the copy of the reports, the buyer must give it to them. And we actually do it 10 days afterwards. So if they terminate and the seller wants to see the report, it's written into the contract that the buyer must provide it. Time for disapproval of the items in the original or amended title reports. We're going to talk about title reports now. Objections on amended can only be to the amended items. So let's say you get a title report that has, there's one thing, and then all of a sudden they do an amended one because maybe the person's name was too similar to others, so they wanted some documentation so they could add some stuff. You can only object to those items that were added. You can't go back and say, well, now I see this. No, you have to do only with those amended ones. But we do now have timeframes for amended reports. It's not designed to give an out for typical amendments, removal of exceptions, change in lender or loan amount, but for substantial amendments. Let's say that they haven't found that there's not an easement, or there is an easement or something that was missed. They bring that back in. That easement now shows up on the preliminary title. That is a material fact to the transaction, and therefore the buyer can back out because of that particular easement. I don't see that this is going to happen that often, but it is something that you need to pay attention to, that if it is a substantial amendment to it. Actually, I will give you an example. There was one that I had many years ago where the seller had filed for bankruptcy, but unfortunately, one of the items had not been sent to the courts. They did not remove it. It was still on there. It was in a collection agency, and the debt was for like $100, but it was with Montgomery Ward's. Well, if any of you remember, Montgomery Ward's has been out of business for how many years? Nobody could tell us who could pay. I mean, we're all willing to pay the $100 some odd to take it away, but it had to go to a judge to get that removed. That was something that it killed that transaction, because that was something that the seller could not fix right away. It took them like 6 months to get it resolved. But that is a substantial amendment that came up on the amended return of the title report. And that would be something you could use. Okay, buyer's failure to provide written disapproval and notice of termination within the time set forth in this section constitute buyer's acceptance of the matters disclosed in the preliminary title report. So keep in mind that silence means acceptance. So if you're totally up to it, then that's fine. You don't have to do anything. You have the 5 days to review it. Please read it. I know we have the saying that says realtors don't read, RDR, realtors don't read, but read the title report, make sure everybody understands what's on it, and go through and look at your timeframes. If it looks like it's going to be a complicated piece of property, you may actually want to have more than 5 business days to have the buyer review it. You may want to put in 10 business days because there's going to be some other things. Again, also, if you put in 5 business days, something comes up and you need more time, that's when you do your addendum that says, hey, we need more time to review the title report and go through those options for the seller to do a cure on it as well. So keep in mind, deadlines are deadlines. Smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. This one, you'll notice that there is no options for number of days. Prior to the buyer's appraisal, or if no appraisal is conducted, at least 5 business days before closing, seller shall provide installed working smoke detectors or the required number of approved smoke alarms. And if the home has a CO source, it was built or remodeled after 2011, regardless if it has a CO source, 1 or more functioning CO alarms. That is straight out of the fire marshal's wording. So if you have a question on it, go to the state fire marshal's website. There is a provision that pays, that who is clarifying who pays the cost of the reinspection for the late installation. Um, the reason why this is all in here and why it is so important is the fact that we did have down in Southern Oregon a situation where the seller put the smoke alarm and carbon monoxide detectors in, did not pull the little yellow tab, and buyers moved in over the weekend. It turned cold, they turned the heater on, and when they didn't show up for work the next morning, they were found dead in the house from carbon monoxide poisoning. So it's really, really important that two things. Number one, that they have them working and installed. Can't just be those smoke alarms sitting on the counter. It must be installed. And keep in mind, carbon monoxide is only good for 5 years. Smoke alarms are good for 10 years. But if you have a combo, it's only good for 5. So they may have said, oh, it's just been a couple of years. Best practice, get them replaced. So, but this one actually does say that if they do not replace them, they are not the current ones. And the inspector has to go back, the appraiser has to go back, the seller's going to pay for it. If reinspection by buyer's lender or appraisal is needed because of seller's failure to install the working detectors, seller will be responsible for the cost of reinspection. Right up front, do it. It's in everybody's best interest to make sure that you have good functioning smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. Addresses unforeseen damage on property prior to close of escrow and the timeframes for notification, negotiation, repairs, and closing. The buyer gets right to terminate and recover costs under certain circumstances. Let's say a tree falls in the house and splits it in half. That is a reason, it's something that the seller is going to have to deal with the insurance company, but the buyer can back out at that point because it is something that is they can't proceed with because of the damage to the house. So it's post-destruction period. So there is time frames in here to be able to negotiate it. Maybe the buyers are okay with sticking it out and waiting until everything gets done. In some of those cases, by the time the insurance company and whatever else you need, it could be a year or so. But that's up to the parties involved. Lead-based hazard, again, we put it in here. We've already gone over that form, but federal law requires that before being obligated to a contract to buy a housing unit built prior to 1978, seller must disclose to buyer any known information concerning the presence of lead-based paint. Again, it's seller to buyer. We are just the conduits to get it to them. And you always provide the disclosure prior to writing an offer or attaching a counter offer. Best practices is the counter offer, the buyer needs to have the ability to back out of the transaction because of that. So keep that in mind with your deadlines. New construction. Again, you're going to use the regular PSA for that form, but then again, new construction is just an addition. Obviously if it's new construction, it's brand new, they've got a building permit, it's pretty easy to figure out. The key is 50,000 or more on improvements within the 90 calendar days before closing. Sometimes you don't think about it. Well, the roof was only $15,000 and we had this done, we had that done. It's a total of 50,000. And these days with the cost of goods, you could easily make that $50,000 number. But again, 90 days is the key as well. Nice thing is after that, there are no more selections to be made on the purchase and sale agreement until line 470 on page 10. This is the rest of the information is any section should be used using the journal addendum. One of the things I would say is if you need to change anything in any of the sections that are just the boilerplate, talk to your managing principal broker. You may have to get an attorney to make the change. It depends on how it is done. So here's just kind of a highlight of the different PSA provisions. One is the terms used throughout there's definitions. Proration of taxes, fees, utilities, rents, deposits. Again, we've also notified that the buyer is to pay for the remaining fuel in the tanks. Closing costs allocation, including broker compensation. Yes, broker compensation is actually addressed in this, so that everybody's clear on how it's going to be done. Closing, possession, property condition, cleaning, defines what that means. And gives the buyer the ability to take the seller to the small claims court if they have to have a professional company come in and take things out. That is something, one of the problems that we had, and I had a whole lot of discussion as we're doing this, is one man's clean as another man's filthy. But it's kind of, there's a standard called broom clean, meaning that you've brushed everything out. But all of the junk that is there is left. Is if the buyer has to do something with it, then they can go after the seller for paying for that. And it is in the contract. Default, notice of default. We're going to go over those forms, the specified provision and an opportunity to cure. Again, we have it in there, opportunity to cure. If it is not cured, then it becomes a default. However, there are 3 automatic defaults in which don't require notice of default. They are: the buyer fails to pay any portion of the earnest money, buyer seller misrepresents a material fact about the contract. They've lied about something, and the party wrongfully fails to close and satisfy a condition at closing. Those are the only 3 things that you don't have to do a notice of cure. And then there's termination, escrow instructions. We're going to get to that here in just a minute. Earnest money disposition. Buyer and seller rights to earnest money plus liquidated damages provisions. That is in there. Again, read through these things and make sure that you understand. Dispute resolution, small claims court, then mediation, and then binding arbitration. Always remember getting an attorney advice in disputes. And then just a side note that if you're with PMAR, which is the Portland Metro, they use the buyer and seller mediation program. So that's written into the contract. And then not allowed without seller's prior written consent and or assigns. That actually goes to a little side note that there is a bill at the legislature to make wholesalers actually be licensed with the real estate agency. And a wholesaler is somebody that puts an offer in on a house, but they have they will not actually be purchasing it. They're going to actually resell it before the closing date to someone else and then take the money from there. So that's in the legislature right now. We're going to be watching for that. But assignment not allowed on the seller's prior written consent. So, sometimes we see that, what is going to be the name? It's to be determined. That's not going to be allowed. You need to put in what it's going to be. If you want to put it in their names and that they're going to want to change it to a trust, then put that on an addendum. But it needs to have and or assigns in it. Okay, on this last page, we have offer automatically expires on this date at 5 p.m. or time. This is one of those where we use calendar days and business days kind of interchangeably, but you can put in the time and the date. One thing to note, and this is a deadline to accept what is written, not a response time. If the offer expires for the response, there is no need to extend the response time in order to make the seller counteroffer. Acceptance of the offer after expiration requires the use of Form 2.3. So what it says is that if they need to accept it by this time, and that we're doing counteroffers in it as well. You want to make sure that you understand that time frame is for the offer and counteroffers. And then also we still have the acknowledgement for risk management on purpose. It is just showing that it was delivered to the seller at this particular time. We want to actually say that it was given. in this turmoil that we've had over the last few years where we've had multiple offers. One of the things the buyers are going after sellers in mediation, besides not having everything exposed at the property disclosures. But one of them is that I don't feel that my offer was actually presented. And so this is really important that you put it in there, that it says that you presented it to the seller at this time and that you have evidence of it. So no questions. We're gonna give a little break here. It's 11:20. Let's get back here at 11:35. Okay, we'll be right back.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Amy. The tenant vacancy addendum, clarifying the notice issues, timing, requirements, possession. One thing I will tell you is to please make sure on every transaction that you go to, when you go to the Oregon Realtor forms, use the latest version of anything that has to do with tenants, because of the fact, like I said, there's laws changing quickly, and we will update these as the laws change, because a lot of them are going to be changing, I think, this year. So note that. Okay, so this form is for owner occupied purchases. So the tenant is in there, owner occupied is going to be taking over. Creates an orderly step-by-step process to notify, terminate tenancy, and vacate the property. It's designed to comply with Oregon and federal law, but notifies both clients to seek expert advice, as we always do. And again, we know that the Oregon laws are going to be changing again. So make sure that you're using the latest version of this. Allows for, but does not mandate, a vacant at closing contingency. And then it addresses estoppel notices and assignment of leases if needed. So let's kind of look at one. So here we go. This document this document is for the tenant vacancy. What you should be, sorry guys, people are wanting to be admitted, and it's going over my what I'm supposed to be reading here for you. The big thing is that you should get this information from the listing broker before you fill it out. That it's in the best interest of everybody if you know what's going on. I know that means you might actually have to talk to the listing broker, but it's everybody's best interest that you talk to the listing broker. Okay, so here's how this form works. It's got, of course, everything on the top part, just like we do on all of them. Date tenancy began. I know in here they put 10.5 months ago. Please put the actual date. The idea is that it's we did this for the purpose of the training so that you would get into your mind that it's less than 1 year, but put the date in, and then the fixed term lease ending and put the date in, not 1.5 months. It's much better to do it with actual dates. Primary resident, buyer intends to occupy home as a primary residence. If it's this on this particular case, it is yes. So make sure that you fully understand that if it's not, we're going to be doing a different form. There it goes. If it's no, 4.2 investment property addendum should be used. So that's a little bit different, because what it's going to do is it will take you to investments, talk about the estoppels that need to be done, and it isn't going to be owner occupied. The rules are very different having to do with that. So seller will not be issuing a termination notice on it. So that is one of the items that is probably could change. So keep that in mind. And here's another thing we put in here, and I wish we didn't have to, but we do. Buyer and sellers, real estate agents are not expert in landlord tenant laws. If they have any questions, they need to seek legal advice. Sent them to the Renter Owners Association website, where there's attorneys listed on there that deal in nothing but tenant law. So if there's a question, you don't answer the question. You have your counselor or get legal counsel on it. The process of having tenants vacate a property by the close of escrow requires close coordination between the agents. Absolutely true. The 4 steps are providing the lease is timely, because if, they need to understand what's going on there. 2, set an agreed to legal termination of tenancy date. Again, a date, not just a timeline. Provide a copy of the termination notice timely, and notify of any changes throughout. It's important that you use, there's a lot of deadlines in here. We got to keep on top of them for that. So keep that in mind as you're going forward with tenancy. You might need to have the estoppel certificate from the seller that shows what the tenants believe as their down payment, deposits, all of that for that. And then verify buyer's willingness to help pay relocation assistance. We've written this in here in some cities. I know Portland had something that was relocation assistance required. It may or may not need to be required. That is one thing that I believe we will see also in this year's legislation. So pay attention to this. It's important that the seller shows that this is what's happening. The buyer may agree to reimburse seller for relocation if they're going to be living in it themselves. They may not. They may say, seller, you need to get them out at any cost. So this is an important section that you need to go over with both parties. Vacancy. If the vacancy contingency box is checked yes, this section requires buyer to review and confirm that the termination notice ensures tenants out before close of escrow. If not, buyer is to presume to have released the vacancy contingency. So again, if that box is not checked, if it's no, buyer is presumed to have released the vacancy contingency, which means that they want to have it. They need to make sure that the house is empty when they get close of escrow, or it is not. So that's another part of the discussion that you need to have with your buyers to determine what they want. And there may be have to be some negotiation on what the seller is going to do as well. If tenant remains on property after the end of the termination date, seller must promptly notify buyer. Buyer has 2 business days or X to either terminate the transaction with refund of earnest money or renegotiate the terms of the agreement with the seller. Again, we've written in opportunities to cure on each of these different areas, so that it's just not an axe coming down and saying that's it. They can say if the tenant remains on the property, buyer, you guys are gonna have to change the close of escrow. What have you on that. It is possible that there may be some renegotiations because in some cases the tenant can't find another place to move to. So that's always a possibility as well. This is kind of it creates a clear assignment language. The buyer and the seller agree to assign all the seller's interest in the lease to buyer upon successful closing a sale agreement. Buyer agrees to assume all rights, liabilities, and duties therein related to the lease upon successful close of sale. One of the things that you need to know is that deposits, cleaning deposits, first and last month's rent, all of that actually is considered income to the landlord, and they do not by statute have to give it up to the buyer, pass it on to the buyer. This actually says, yes, you will pass whatever that money is held on behalf of the tenant. You have to pass it to the buyer. And why that was written in there is because I got to learn it the hard way. Yeah, we won't go over that. So, if it's going to be assigned, we need to make sure that everybody is in knowledge of it. And the best practices on this too, just a little side note, make sure that if you have to talk to the tenant or get some sort of confirmation from the tenant that they have received it. So that's an important aspect to it all. Seller indemnification. Seller agrees to indemnify buyer from any and all claims, suits, judgments against the buyer that occurred during a trial, resulting from seller's failure to give proper termination notice to tenant or any seller violation of the rental agreement or Oregon law. basically what we wanted to do is to make sure that if something happens, while you're in this transaction, that the seller is responsible for the property until the close of escrow when it gets turned over to the buyer. Okay, I see I had a note here. You're asking what our overall use of the forms. We're basically saying, we're encouraging everybody to use these forms. And I'll talk about a little bit of what happens when they get mixed up. But for this year, I think we're going to be seeing both. But we're encouraging to use these because these are a whole lot easier. Once you start doing a transaction in it, you're going to find them a whole lot easier to work with. So, counter offer. Okay, so let's do a counter offer. All right, so the counter offer is, remember our price was 4075. They came in at 385. You're going to counter at 395, up the earnest money by $1,000. Make sure that you notice the door knocker is not included. Notice for tenants to vacate being given after release of the due diligence and preliminary title contingencies. So we're addressing things that we know. And then the counter offer expires in 24 hours. So let's look at this. So again, top is still going to be the same. One thing, this is the same counter offer, whether it's a buyer or a seller. You just put in, this is the seller counter offer 1 or 2 or 3, buyer counter offer 1, 2 or 3. I was always taught that if you do more than 3 counter offers, probably need to rewrite it. But anyhow, this section, so this is from the seller, so we're going to fill that in. And then, buyer's offer, buyer's counter offer, and it same thing on the buyer section. Seller may withdraw this counter offer by giving buyer oral or written notice of withdrawal prior to a mutual acceptance. Let me read that again. Giving buyer oral or written notice of withdrawal. You can make the phone call and says the buyer is withdrawing it. Now, best practices is that if you make the phone call that says they are withdrawing it, follow it up with an email that says they are withdrawing this offer. It is best to make sure that you document, kind of my words for the day. So make sure that they are doing that. Same thing with buyers. It says buyer may withdraw this counter offer oral or written. So again, if you do it verbally, go ahead and follow it up somewhere in writing, whether it's an email or a text or something that you can say, I actually sent it to you. Okay, so the counter offer is pretty much just what we've all been used to. The modifies, the only identifies items that we're changing. Click too fast. So all of that, we had it written out that you would have done this the same in the other forms. The deadline to accept what is written, not a response time. Okay. The counter offer expires. There is no need to extend response time in order to make a new counter offer. To acceptance of the counter offer after expiration, use form 2.3. We actually have one that says, hey, we've expired on it. So, you should kind of think about that when you do the original date for the offer being expired, that this counter offer is inside of that date. Make sure that you following your own dates on all of this. And again, we have our accepts, rejects, counters, however you want to do that, and the time, all the signatures and stuff. Okay, let's talk about the repair addendum. So we're going to ask them to do a repairs. So let's do a deal with repairs. So the buyers have had the property inspected, discover some problems, get bids, and provide sellers with a repair addendum, asking for the seller to fix the dry rot and make the chimney repairs. Sellers agree to do the repairs. Sellers notified the buyers of completed repairs, but on reinspection, it reveals faulty work. Buyers provide sellers with a list of deficient repairs. Sellers agree to get the repairs done on time. This transaction closes. So let's go over this in alternate ending number 1. So repair addendum, see it's an addendum, so it's always going to be under a 2. It'll be under there. Same top. Party presenting this repair addendum number 1. Is it the buyer or the seller? And so the seller to contract with licensed and bonded contractors the following. This form actually allows the seller to do some of the work. We want to make sure that it is workmanlike and being as well as non-licensed. I want to get to this page because I think this spells it out. Hire Wally's Quality Fixer to repair the dry rot in the kitchen and hall bath and replace all disturbed flooring per the attached bid. And then seller to perform the following repairs. Hire Chimney LLC to properly seal the damaged chimney liner per attached bid. Now, what I found when teaching this course is that Chimney LLC should probably be under a licensed bonded contractor. Where would you accept it to that the seller to do the following repairs? Pretty much you need to make sure that as to protect the buyer to make sure that they are actually having licensed bonded contractors doing the work. An example of where the seller may be able to do something and not actually have to have a hired contractor is, let's say there's a tree branch on the roof and they want to just cut that branch off. And it's something fairly simple that the seller could do, but they need to spell it out so that the seller knows, or the buyer knows, that the seller is going to do it and not hire a professional. When in doubt, hire the professional, making sure that things are done. Now, the completion date. This expanded process identifies when the repairs will be completed and requires a notice of completion from the seller to the buyer. This starts the re-inspection process with tight timeframes. Keep in mind, we are putting some tight timeframes. So the seller shall have have those all completed by a certain date. And seller promptly notify buyer in writing using the notice of completion. We're going to go over that. Buyer will have X days to have the reinspection done. 3 business days, 2 business days. Again, notice it's in business to reinspect the property after receiving notification from seller. Buyer does not complete the re-inspections by the end of the re-inspection period or does not deliver notice and evidence of deficiencies to the seller by the end of the re-inspection period, buyer will be deemed to have accepted the seller's repairs as sufficient. Keep that in mind. If they do nothing and the clock ticks off and it's 5:01 on day 2, they accepted it. So it's really important that you understand your timelines here to make sure that they are going and having the reinspection done. Seller gets the right to correct repair deficiencies, but buyer can terminate and get back earnest money if deficient repairs aren't completed in a manner reasonably satisfactory to the buyer. Again, seller will have X business days after receiving buyer's notice and evidence of deficiencies to have repairs completed as described above and provide buyer with evidence of the same. If seller fails to complete the repairs as described, buyer may terminate this transaction within 2 business days. So buyer can terminate if the seller is unwilling to have it repaired correctly or whatever the deficiency happens to be. Again, you're going to do the buyer's notice of termination on that. If buyer and seller mutually accept this repair addendum, modify payment terms in lieu of repairs on the during the due diligence, the due diligent period ends. So with that, in this section down here, oops, I skipped a slide. Let me go back for a minute. I did skip. One of the things is that buyer can ask for and must receive, if requested, invoices from the seller. This is just best practices too. Give them the name of the roofer, give them the name of the plumber. So if after they're moved into the house, they have the name of that contractor to go call and say, hey, you know my house, can you come fix this? So it is something that is written into the contract. Again, the seller doesn't have to automatically do it. The buyer must request. Let's go back here. If the due diligence period ends, so we've actually written in here because sometimes we say the price is going to be $5,000 off in lieu of a repair of some sort. That is written in here that says that modify payment terms in lieu of repairs. It's in there now so that you can't just say changing the price and not say why. You have to put it in there. If buyer and seller mutually accept this repair addendum, that will be now is a part of the transaction. Okay, so they've made their request. They want Chimney to come back out. And notice of completion of repairs, the orderly process for reinspection, correction of faulty work. So we want to spell out how it's supposed to come out. So simple notice from the seller to the buyer that starts the process of reinspection. Hey buyer, hey, we've finished these repairs that you asked for. And here's our signature. That's it. That's the entire form. It says that it's been done. So now the buyer knows that. And, step one, notifies buyer the repairs are done and have completed as described in that addendum. Then step two, buyer notices a deficiency. Upon delivery of seller's signed notice of completion, buyer has until the end of the reinspection period to go in and actually have it reinspected. And if it's not done, if buyer does not complete the reinspections by the end of the reinspection period, again, no news is you're done. But they need to identify what happens if there was a deficiency. So step three is spell it out, be very specific. And also notice in the wording, they only have the ability to reinspect those items that were requested for repairs. It does not say, hey, we also want to add in this. That can only be done if everybody's in agreement with it, but that's not the gist of this form. It is they're going to reinspect only those items that they requested to have repaired. And reinspection reports, bids, show them, give them the evidence that, hey, our inspector came back out and you didn't even do the hall bathroom. That was part of it as well. So that, evidence, again, disclosure is the big thing on it. So based on superior inspections, re-inspections, sellers will properly replace the flooring in the hall bath where the dry rot was removed, and then have chimney caulk remaining cracks in the chimney liner. Obviously those weren't done, so that's now being done. So it also says buyer signatures for use if the buyer has notified seller repair deficiencies. If they aren't, there isn't anything, they don't have to sign. The seller corrections and buyer termination upon the delivery of the buyer's notice and evidence of repairs, seller has to the end of the correction period described in section 6 of the repair addendum to have the repairs completed and get the information over to the buyer. Seller has a predetermined time to provide evidence of a competently completed deficiencies, or buyer can exercise the right to terminate the transaction. So that's important that they understand that, hey, we've given you the chance to cure it, but you didn't. So now we're going to terminate. So before I leave that, let me check chat. So in lieu of price to lender may not require, what about a lender? Will they not require repair being done? That's going to be up to the lender to decide whether or not they have the repair done. And we know that right now there's some lenders that will say, I don't want anything to do with, I don't want to know that that's for repairs or whatever. Sorry, that we're actually putting it in there that it is in lieu of repairs. And if the appraiser calls for it, that's a whole different ballgame. That actually ends up being something else that you need to negotiate. But that's no different than what we're doing now. So hopefully that answers that question. Sorry, had a thought and got lonely and left. Okay, so let's talk about this deal, but have an alternate ending to it. After inspection, bids, submissions of repair addendum, sellers accept buyer's return and begin work. Sellers don't get the repairs done on time, even when buyers insist. Buyers provide notice of default and opportunity to cure. Sellers still don't get the repairs done. So now they're going to terminate. And we're going to go through that process as well. So notice of default and opportunity to cure. Things are right, but not be correct. So the notice of default and opportunity to cure helps get contract promises back on track and using the right of termination to motivate action. sets out the transaction defaults that arise in the contracts using checkboxes drafted to match the default language found in the Oregon forms, and provides clear and orderly process for resolving issues, bringing transactions back into compliance or terminating. These forms that were actually, the attorneys came up with them, and I really like them. So let's talk about this. Buyer's notice of default and opportunity to cure. Same thing, same top part. Default with cure period. Upon receipt of this notice, seller has 3 business days, or if more time is required, X business days, or closing, whichever is earlier. So we actually give you timelines that says, hey, seller, you have this time to get this done. And then cure all defaults as described in section 5, which we'll get to here in a minute, to provide the buyer in writing. This is all of the possible defaults. Look at all of this. Seller communicated dissatisfaction. Anything having to do with the transaction in any of the forms is listed on here. So there's a long list. For this one, we're going to be using line 26, form 2.5 repair addendum. Seller has not completed repairs as agreed upon date. That's the one. But again, there's all these different things that the seller did not do, and the buyer is calling him out on it. And then we'll go through it. There is a additional default provisions, but I don't know what you'd fill in there, because if you'll notice, there is, tenant occupied, there is agricultural tenant addendum. Any place there was a chance that there was a contingency in any of the forms are listed on this document. So, if there is an additional default that needs to be done, maybe you did agree to something on an addendum, that can be filled in there. But for the most part, you're probably going to be seeing this whole entire list. In fact, you can see that it ends on line 37. And then when we go here to the end, it goes all the way up to line 79. So we have quite a few different places for you to do that. And then the buyer signs it. They get in there and they have the ability to sign. Could trigger a lender. Yeah, we know that Patty's asking about having putting it in lieu of repairs. The idea is that we don't want to do mortgage fraud, which if you do not disclose something, the buyer does not disclose information to the lender, it could be done. Lenders are looking at these forms and liking them. So if there is, problems that we come up with it, but again, it was considered lender fraud if you do not identify what it is that's being repaired. So that was kind of the basis on it. It was more, it's kind of based in law rather than anything else. We'll just have to, we'll be working through it. One of the things, actually, while Patty kind of reminded me on something, as you are working through these forms and you come up with a situation where this form is not working for us, we need it changed. Don't just say line 71 is stupid. Please don't do that. Say we were using this form in this transaction, and these are the situation, and this is how this form did not help us. And we're going to be very timely on getting the forms updated so that you have the opportunity to see that. That's why I'm saying every time you do a new transaction, get the latest forms, because we will be updating these as we go along, rather than waiting until the end of the year and going through a whole year of something not being correct. So that's just a little side note in there. Okay, notice of termination and response. Notice of termination is not an agreement between the parties. Okay, pay attention to that. It is a notice from one party to the other that a right of termination is being exercised. Termination may return earnest money to the buyer or release it to the seller, depending on the reason noted on the addendum. Notice of termination requires a response from the other party so that escrow receives identical instructions from both parties. So let's look at the buyer's notice of termination. Same thing. They acknowledge same thing up front. There we go. This notice of termination has a list of every specific reason to terminate the sale agreement. So again, we have check boxes. We have a list. You can go through it so that you can just click the box that it follows. Buyers should select a reason from the termination from the list below. We want you to use what we've got written. We've tried to make it easy for that. So in this case, buyers shall not issue this notice of termination if the buyer intends to pursue a claim against seller for specific performance of the sale agreement. Buyers should seek out legal advice from an attorney if they're going to do that. So if they want to sue and terminate for specific performance, send them to an attorney. That's the one area that, we don't want you practicing law. We don't want you getting into trouble because of the law. Response of notice of termination. Within 2 business days, we don't give you an option. After receiving this notice, seller is required that they have received copies of it. Is required under the sale to provide copies of the seller's response to termination. And that goes to the buyer and the escrow agent. So keep in mind that there is a response time and a response form. A warning to the buyer that termination does not automatically mean they get their earnest money back. We all know that sometimes the buyers do something and the earnest money may not go back to them. So buyer acknowledges that if the buyer is in default at the time of issuing this notice of termination, or the buyer's reason for termination is not specifically authorized under the sale agreement, meaning you have the list, seller may be entitled to the earnest money. But we have to explain that out at the very beginning, that earnest money could go to the seller. That is a possibility. But then buyer hereby terminates the sale agreement for the following reasons, and check the reason why. Failure of financing, failure of renegotiated terms of the financing. It gives you the list. We keep going here. Again, all the areas where the seller, why the buyer is, backing out. Seller has not completed repairs, contingent right to purchase anything. Attorney review addendum. Based on the buyer's attorney review, buyer disapproves of the sale agreement. That's another addendum that's in there. So, in this case, seller has not completed the repairs. We've checked that box. Specific instances where the buyer terminates results in a forfeiture of earnest money. Earnest money forfeiture by buyer if seller is not in default. Buyer received a form 5.2 notice of default to cure, and the seller and does not wish to cure the default. And then leased equipment, buyer refuses to assume the leased equipment. Again, leased equipment, most of the time when we see leased equipment nowadays, it has to do with solar panels. And of course, there's the other termination, which I guess go ahead and fill it out. I can't imagine what will be in there, but that's there for the other. And then how is the earnest money going to be distributed? Instruction to escrow, $5,000 to the buyers. And we're tied again, spelling out the company, the officer, and then the escrow number that you have, and then the buyers sign it. Radon mold test. If it is no longer invasive, a seller may state they will not allow it. That is correct. If they will not allow it, that needs to be put in writing, and the buyer needs to make a decision about how that is done, how they're going to handle it. Do they just not want it? And I will tell you that we're seeing more and more transactions with radon testing, because they're finding, as they do testing in one house, they find that there's more in others. So that is going to be coming up. Note that this is not a negotiation. It is the buyer's understanding of the disposition of the earnest money under the terms of the sale agreement. Again, it's the buyer's understanding. So we've done all of that. Now the seller's response. The PSA requires a response after receiving the termination notice. So the buyer says we are terminating it. The seller responds to it. That's what this form is. In invoking the dispute resolution proceeding in the purchase and sale agreement, section 53 may mean small claims court first. Find out the limits in your county. I think for most of the state, it is now $10,000. So know that. But it needs to be noted that it is, however, that dispute resolution, that is in the boilerplate part of the PSA. Now, whatever it says, seller's instructions, $5,000, buyers, the sellers are agreeing that, hey, yeah, we didn't do it, we're not going to do it, and the buyers get the money back. In this example that they've done, they've written the buyers. I always suggest that you write buyers and then put their names in, just as best practices. So you just need to make sure that you match whatever it is you're going to do on the other form for that. This section actually was written by the a title company attorney for us. So a lot of this stuff has to do with what the title companies want in their forms. Now, that doesn't mean that they aren't going to automatically put their forms in. Amy can actually talk about that. But the idea is that we're trying to get it so that everybody understands what's going on at the very beginning. Okay, let's just talk about some additional forms. Get to my cheat sheet because we're almost done, guys. We're almost there. Special situations addendum, late acceptance, new construction and association, waiver of contingencies and release of contingencies, and then a base form change request. Because somebody asked earlier about what happens if we mix forms. So let's go through those. Late acceptance addendum, accepting an offer or counter offer after it has expired. Late acceptance addendum to real estate purchase agreement. So what we're doing here is saying, hey, we were trying to get everything done, but we went past the deadline. We're in agreement that we want to make sure that it's counter offer or offer did not happen, but we're still all in agreement. You know, it's one of those situations where you may not get everybody's signature. You've all come to an agreement, but somebody's traveling or some reason they can't get the signatures on there. This is where you would use this. But it's the buyer's offer, buyer's counter offer, however. Time periods, mutual acceptance sale agreement will occur when the receiving party delivers a signed and dated copy of this late acceptance addendum to the late party within 1 calendar day. So you want to do it quickly, but it says, hey, we're all in agreement. Let's use this particular form. 1 calendar day to respond to late acceptance, otherwise no deal. That is one thing that it is only 1 calendar day. So it is something to be, you got to watch those timelines. You got to make sure that you understand the deadline. New construction. This is the one that will, this is the form that will come up that if you've clicked the $50,000 of upgrades on the last 90 days. So it'll say new construction addendum that it is for construction or will be completed, is or will be completed within 90 days. A construction is or will be completed more than 90 days, or 50,000 or more improvement costs have been made or spent within 90 days. So you have your options of which one it is. Is there going to need to be early issue title insurance on this? The lender will tell you whether you do or not. And the seller status says the CCB number of the contractor that's doing the work. You may end up having more than one contractor if it's, like I said, $50,000 more an improvement. So you may end up having to do an addendum to put the extra information. But the CCB number, you have enough room to put at least a couple of numbers in there. It is not an Oregon licensed contractor. So if it's not, the buyer needs to be notified that the person doing the work is not a CCB licensed contractor. And then they need to make a decision of whether or not they want to continue. So that, you know, maybe the seller did it themselves. But again, it's disclosing to the buyer, and then the buyer gets the opportunity to make the decision based on the information that they had. You know, they may say that's fine. Maybe they say, no, it's not fine. You know, maybe the seller and friends put the roof on. So they did not have a licensed bonded contractor. You may or may not want to continue with that because it may not be correct. That roof may not be, you know, may leak, it may have problems. We'll have to see. So that is the decision to be made by the buyer, but the seller needs to be honest and truthful in filling that out. One other thing to note is that 50,000 or more improvement costs, there may or may not be a permit. You notice that there is nothing on here about a permit. And that's the reason why, is because some, they may, a roof may not require a permit. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. So there's nothing in here. It is the CCB number that they are looking for. Association addendum. This just has to do with the homeowners association, planned communities, townhomes, and how that all works out. We all know this form from having to deal with homeowners, but one of the things to better understand and provided documents, buyer is encouraged to seek out independent professional services, special in reviewing governance, finance, and insurance documents of the association. They need to get the documents, they need to have time to review it, and they need to make sure that they if they don't feel confident in it, to get an attorney, get a CPA to look at it. There are companies that will review all of that information and give you a response. Now, it's going to cost money, but in some cases that might be important. Waiver of contingencies, give up the right to exercise important buyer protections and investigations. Waiver of contingencies, the giving up the important protection is a big deal. Agents should advise against it. Standard contingencies in the contract, we put it in big bold letters. Hey, make sure you fully understand why you are not doing this. There are times when we have had to do that here lately, that buyers actually waived, like for instance, they waived the inspections. And if you talk to the mediation arbitration companies up in Portland that have been doing a lot of the arbitrations and mediations, biggest thing is that the buyers probably should have had their own inspections. And the buyers are suing sellers for not disclosing information, and they're going to mediation. And that's pretty much where they're heading right now, is because of the fact that it is, they should have had the inspection. So we don't want you doing this, but if they are going to do a waiver of contingencies, have them make sure they go over this form, they understand it, and the reasonings why. And knowingly and voluntarily agrees to waive any rights of the sale agreement. So make sure that this is the buyer's decision. Again, in this whole paperwork, we want to make sure that it is the seller making the decision, the buyer making the decision. It is not the agents making the decision on their behalf. And then modification or waiver. So modifying standard contingencies is a form of a waiver, and these address the common negotiation strategies buyers use to compete in the marketplace. So buyer waives the loan contingency and appraiser, or they waive the appraisal contingency, and buyer is obligated to purchase regard of the lender's appraisal value. One of the things that I had happened here in the last couple of years was that the lender was only wanting to make sure that the value of the house was more than the amount that they were lending. Had nothing to do with the actual value and the price that the buyers were paying for it. They just wanted to make sure that there was more value to cover their loan, which is a little different in how this actually is worded. It says that the appraisal must be at or above the purchase price. So, that may be an area where you would use that line. And then buyer modifies the appraisal contingency as follows. If they choose either one of those, you want to make sure you've talked to that lender, that the lender is really doing that and the lender knows that, because that could be an issue as well. I see I have a chat note. That told by attorney that reports are available to all parties that the seller sells as is. Buyer closing costs can be paid by the seller. They can use money for closing costs. This is Patty, you're correct in all of this. So they have direction on what to do. Sellers don't have the ability to do the repairs. They just aren't going to do them. One of the things we know right now is that roofers are out so how many months. So they know that. This was based on the information that the attorneys got. I'm actually going to take your note, Patty, and send it off to the attorneys at at Oregon Realtors forums and let them respond to us on it. Because you're right, there's an issue here, and I want them to come back with a good answer for us. Release of contingencies, acknowledging satisfaction within the process and the releasing rights to terminate. It's releasing contingency, not required doing all the steps outlined on the contingency, but it does require satisfaction that the contingency protection is no longer needed. So they may not have the actual report, but they know that that contingency, they're fine, they're done with it, they've gone on. So it's acknowledging that the contingency is passed. Once again, instead of having to write it all out, we've written it out for you. The release of title review contingency, release of lead hazard, financing contingencies, whatever other contingencies that they may have had. We've spelled it out for you to help make it a little bit easier on that. And again, other contingencies, that's where you would put in well or septic or something like that. We didn't go through everyone on this one. Base form changes. Okay. This is, I got a question earlier, is which one do you choose to use? You need to have your principal broker decide which one they want to use, which form. And the way that my company is handling it is that if the buyer, right now, if the buyer sends over a form on Oregon Realtors forms, that transaction from that point forward will be on Oregon Realtors. If they do it on ORAF, that transaction will be done on there. And the reason is that there are some pretty big differences on how we handle things. You've heard a lot about the deadlines and stuff, that there are differences. So ORAF needs to stay with ORAF, ORs needs to stay with OR, and make your decision on which ones you want to use. Again, I would say talk to your managing principal broker about which actual set of forms they want you to use on that. So it's here is that the section is a reminder to sellers and buyers and their agents that the form products are not interchangeable, and in order to receive the benefits of consistent language and contract provisions, only one form product should be used in a transaction. Now, one of the things that I've asked, and actually I got asked earlier this week, I haven't gotten the back from the attorneys yet, is what happens if the offer comes in on Oregon Realtor forms and they respond with an OREF forms, how to handle that. And when I get that, I will send it out to Amy and we'll make sure that you guys get an answer to that question as well. My feeling my opinion is that you reject it and ask them to put it on the other form, but I want the attorneys to tell me that before we go on. So, and one of the questions I got asked is that, on all of these things, whether it be the title company, inspectors, the lenders, any of these, it is the party's decision to make that. We as the brokers do not make the decision. But probably 99% of the time, the seller or the buyer doesn't really know the difference between these forms. They don't have an opinion on it. So they will be taking your lead. And I think once you start using these forms, you're going to like them. So requester, buyer or seller makes this base form change request. So, it could be that they want to stay in one form. It does allow, this form actually allows you to say, hey, we want it resubmitted on another set of forms. And we do have Oregon Realtors forms and then other. Actually, one of the other forms that is out there is the Stevens Nest forms. There's a lot of different forms. And as I got taught very early on by one of my mentors, Patty Gilstrap, they could be written on a bar napkin if it need to be, but we don't want you doing that. We want you to actually be using the set of forms. So the requester is saying that they want the counter offer to be on one or the other. Again, what I would tell you to do is talk to the listing agent before you even write it. So, because what you don't want to do is be embarrassed because you're using a different set of forms. And again, additional questions or comments, you've got the hotline you can call. And the forms at Oregon Realtors, they're monitoring it quite a bit. I've had to talk to them. They're a little bit overwhelmed right now because of all the classes that we're all teaching. But the additional questions, comments about forms, send it to them. And again, if you have a situation where this form doesn't work, go ahead and send us the information about it. Even, like scratch out the names of it, but send it to us so that we can actually fully understand and be able to do, to maybe make changes to it. And then you'll be getting a feedback that we'll be sending out to Amy that comes from the Oregon Realtor forms. So that's it. Stop my sharing, and I see one more chat. One of the things I would tell you again, I talked about this earlier, that's really interesting is take a transaction that you did and use this form. Take the time to actually spell it out. And I think you're going to find that it's going to be very, very, very helpful for you. I think once you start using this forms, you're going to like it. So any other questions? We're going to give you the full 3 hours, even though we're a little short. We're okay. Any other questions that you guys have?
You're getting lots of great reviews in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, you guys didn't ask a lot of questions because usually the last half hour I'm doing nothing but the invasive test. That was, you know what, I'm going to have to, I don't remember why they said that the radon was not an invasive test. I need to, let me ask the attorneys on that one. So I've got 3 questions for the attorneys and they all come from Patty. Yes, Patty. That's okay. All righty. Any other questions? Get, my email, my information is on there. You're free to email me. And if I can't answer it, I'll get the attorneys involved and get them to answer it. The big thing is that, you can take this class again if you want to, and you can go to the forms library where they've got lots of videos. They're filming them almost every single day. So they're trying to get caught up with things. So, all righty.
Marie, am I able to send out the video so that they can review anything that you might have touched on? Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, she'll do the recording on it. So with that, you guys have a great afternoon. Thank you
so much. Thank you, Marie.
All righty. Bye.
We'll all see your CEs in your inbox shortly. Thank you.